Good day, everyone. I was going to say good morning, but it is really good day, everyone, and good evening and good night for some. My name's Marcus Vaughan. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you today to undertake and conduct the Big Resilience Reset Part 5. Yes, this is the 5th installment of the Big Resilience Reset. It's actually the 1-year anniversary. So very excited to still be here. And as I've just been informed, I think we're on the cusp of actually having a record attendance for the Big Resilience Reset. So still going strong. And that is because we have such a big turnout of you people turning up to have a really open conversation about pushing the discipline and the industry forward. So first and foremost, thank you very much for joining. I know the time zones can be really challenging. I've seen that in the LinkedIn comments this week. And appreciate, obviously, everyone who's a little bit outside of ours, whether that's in the evening over in the UK and Europe or South Africa, or whether that is very early in the morning as it is here across Australia and the Asia Pacific region. So thank you very much for turning up. Join with me today, I've got none other than James Green, the co-founder of Illuminate Advisory. James, welcome back.
Thanks for having me again, Marcus.
It's always a pleasure. And first time panelist on the Big Resilience Reset, is my absolute honor to introduce everyone to Paula Fontana. Paula, welcome.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
It is very exciting to have you, Paula. Before we get into it, guys, I will just go through a little bit of housekeeping. Hopefully the screen's still sharing there. So this session, we are going to be talking a lot about the risk and resilience, really focusing on that theme of the convergence of risk and resilience. But to be perfectly open and honest, we'll go where the conversation takes us. And a lot of that is also checking in on what's happening in that chat channel. So my first item of housekeeping here is, guys, if you're not in the chat channel yet, get in the chat channel. It is open up, get that thing started. That's where the real action is. That's where the collaboration and thought leadership share happens in this. And that's to be perfectly honest, it's almost why I'm here. It's a fantastic forum to get some thought from right around the world. The webinar will be televised. And when I say televised, I mean we are recording it, yes, and we will be distributing it via link after this. So don't worry, you don't have to ask that question halfway through. Feedback is a gift. It is that time of year for giving. Please give your feedback. It makes all of us very happy to read the comments, whether they're absolutely brutal and you're going for the jugular, or whether they are, again, complimentary as well. All feedback we take on board. We're really here to make this more valuable for you. So if you got feedback, please do just be open and about how we can improve that. The popcorn's BYO. It's not that time of day for me. I'm drinking triple shot soy lattes at the moment, of all things. Just to get the motor running. And I'm sure no matter where you are, you've got your choice. That's really up to you what you bring to this. But please do get in there. As I mentioned, the chat channels where this is really happening. So if you're not in there yet, get in there now. All right, without me babbling on much longer, I'm going to get this party started. James, I'm going to start with you. We are a year into the Big Resilience Reset. As you remember, about 12 months ago, we kicked this thing off with me asking you a pretty blatant question around, is business continuity dead? I think your response back then was, it's not dead, but it's on life support. So 12 months on, we're at the end of 2022, lining up for 2023. Is business continuity dead?
Yeah, absolutely, Marcus. So the most hate mail I ever got is when you asked me that question 12 months ago. So I certainly appreciate you asking me it again. And yes, it's still on life support. The analogy I think of is we're transitioning from horse and buggy to cars. And if you're going to double down on horse and buggy, you're going to be left behind. The future is coming whether you want it to or not. So if your whole purpose in life is to solely do risk assessments and BIAs and BCP plans and exercises, and they just keep you warm at night, you're in trouble. Because to me, only doing those, and I'm not saying don't do those, I'm saying only doing those, you're going to be obsolete in 2 to 3 years because you're going to be further and further away from the needs of the business and the organization that you support.
Paula, obviously newer to that conversation. Well, maybe yes, maybe no, maybe yes online. Is business continuity dead? What's your take on this?
I think there's always going to be a role for business continuity. I think what we're seeing in the industry is that there's a bifurcation of sorts where you've got teams that are sort of focused on the bits and bots of building plans and more of a compliance mindset, right? How do you ensure that you're doing all of the things that the regulators are expecting you to do? But what we're seeing is that, there are even dedicated teams in some instances, right? Coming together really around kind of this concept, which I think, James, you just alluded to, of business agility. And so how do you work together as a business to really respond to sort of whatever the world throws at you, and land on your feet, bigger and better than ever. So I think, what we're seeing is that, I think there will always be that position, for individuals that are more focused on plans. But I think the expectation on the part of the business is that there's this realization that they need to be able to respond at a moment's notice. And how do they integrate that capability into everything that the firm does? And that's really sort of the call to arms that we've seen, I think, over the last several years.
Yeah, I think it was a fascinating insight at the BCI World Forum, and I wrote a blog about this, or partly about this, last week, and got some interesting comments and emails from it. That we were on stage, and I think the question was asked, in the last critical event, who in the room had picked up their BCP? And James, you're in the room of about 100 practitioners at BCI World. I think it was only one person put up their hand to actually say, yeah, I bothered to pick up the BCP. Which asks a really big question of, what does planning need to look like if we're not picking up the plan anymore? And then a bigger question around that, as planners, from a business continuity perspective, where do we really need to be focusing our time and attention to really create, to your point, Paula, business agility, the ability to actually respond, to actually build resilience into an organization? James, I'm interested in, and that's an open question. And so everyone in the chat channel, I'm really interested in your thoughts, because this is where we do bring in, we've got 220 people who registered for this thing around 18 countries around the world. So please drop your thoughts in right now. But James, I'm interested, whilst that's happening, I'm interested in what your take is in terms of, hey, where are we spending our time to get that ROI for the organization and resilience?
Well, first of all, I love the balance that you've brought to this big resilience reset. So while Paula is using words like bifurcation and is very thoughtful and inclusive with her words, Florida man over here, I have a tray full of props that I'm just dying to use and work into anything that we talk about. So I'm really loving the balance. The ROI comes in from what management tells you is important, right? If people think things are important and you're doing those things, there's perceived ROI. A lot of what we do doesn't have a hard ROI in terms of I can measure dollars, or I can say we didn't have a disaster this year, but lining up with what management deems important always have a higher perceived ROI, always.
Yeah. Paula, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does come back to sort of what drives the business, and how do you really connect everything that you're doing back to, the strategic and executive priorities that have been defined by your board and executive team. Like, I think that's just the reality of how organizations operate. But the other thing that I think is important to note is the shift that we've seen in the broader industry away from kind of more of an inward facing view of resilience, right? With operational resilience, like the regulatory community is really focused on, how do you get more connected to your customer and the market, right? And understanding what's ultimately important to the individuals or the organizations that are consuming your products and services, and really prioritizing response, because trying to respond to everything, especially in the moment as you're experiencing these layered events, but ultimately understanding, what are those things that you need to deliver no matter what, and ensuring that you have the proper muscle memory to respond at a moment's notice, right? to those things that sort of impede your ability to deliver those things the way that the customer and the broader market. And these are, in some cases, obviously very critical products and services that we all depend upon, really critical infrastructure. So I think tying it back to the needs of your customers, tying it back to understanding your role in the broader ecosystem, and then of course, thinking about prioritization from an executive perspective, like all very important aspects of how you mobilize resiliency.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're seeing some really interesting comments come through in the chat as well. I mean, there's one word that's trending right now, it's culture, or building culture, which I think is a fascinating take, and also brings upon a whole set of responsibilities to incorporate HR, L&D to really mesh into the fabric of an organization and drive that from top to bottom. So, and some great comments in there around dynamic response. Yeah, Peter Laz is all over it. Dynamic response is the evolution of canned plans. I couldn't agree more. So got some great commentary coming through. Thank you everyone for being highly engaged in this. One thing, I guess with that, that meshing resilience into the organization we wanted to touch on today was this convergence that we're starting to see and feel. And I'm not sure anyone's put their finger on it yet, but it does feel like there's this pull towards converging of risk and resilience in organizations. So I wanted to provoke a little bit of thought. I'm going to use my amazing technology skills here and run a poll, if I can actually find where I run my poll from. Here we go. Okay, so I'm interested in everyone's take here around what resilience looks like in your current organization. So I'm going to launch this poll. So the question is for everyone, where does your organization's resilience function currently report through to? So risk, is resilience sit at the top? Is there actually executive sponsorship there just on resilience? Is it compliance? Is it security? Pick the one that best describes it. I appreciate there's always going to be meshes and merge and overlaps with these, like no two organizations are the same. And if there's some weird and wonderful function I haven't thought of, just drop it in the comments. Service improvement, there we go, we've got one already. So drop it in it's really interesting to see what's the current take. And then I'm going to ask you a follow-on question around where you think it should be as opposed to where it currently is. So we're up to 64%, a few stragglers there, I'll give you another second. Risk is actually winning. I'll show you this in a second. Risk is right out there. All right, here we go. It's coming up. Corporate services, yeah. Safety, that's a good point. Probably should have dropped safety in there. That's a very common one. Yeah, risk. Lots of risk showing up, guys. All right, I'm going to end the poll. Final once. Going. Go on. All right, share the results. Let's have a look at this. So we have risk is standing out at 27%, followed by IT and cybersecurity. That's an interesting take, and I do have a few questions around that. Resilience is in there, 6 out of 60, 10% on resilience. Compliance is there, security is there, operations is there. We've got a few coming up in the comments. Corporate services, people and culture, which is really interesting. Service improvement. So. Okay, so that's where it currently sits. I mean, any observations there, Paula, James, that you want to jump on, make a point about, jump on a soapbox about?
I mean, I love that it's all over the place. Yeah, I'm going to start. Absolutely. I love that it's all over the place, because one of the biggest frustrations I have with resilience frameworks is everyone's trying to cookie cutter resilience. Here's how to do resilience in every family, in every town, in every organization in the world. No, that's crap. Resilience should be different for each organization. So I would expect it to report up through different verticals and be all over the place in each organization.
Yeah, I agree with that. But I do think one of the things that we struggle with in the industry is kind of the nebulousness of resilience. Like, what does it really mean? And so I think like one of the things that I think that's really important for us, kind of irrespective of what our role is in kind of the conversation about resilience, I think painting more concrete pictures as to what does resilience look like, right? And how do you achieve that? I think it's about really making, I was just talking to someone in the agency space. They had suffered a massive cyber breach. They never want to experience that again. And they said, one of the things that they appreciate about, what Illumina is doing is really making the intangible tangible. And I think like that's really what we're being called upon to do at this point in time. And that I totally agree with you. Like it doesn't necessarily matter where it sits, because ultimately the goal is to weave this into everything that the organization does. I will say, kind of coming off the heels of Op Risk, Leon, our director of cybersecurity, and I attended that conference in November, and it was astonishing to me how many, when I think back, a few years ago, how many risk teams now own resilience, which I think is really exciting, right? Because when you think about where we started, as such a short time ago, like if you think about like 3 to 4 years ago, like this whole idea of integrating risk and resilience was just insane. Like people just really had a hard time thinking about like how can we make that happen? But I think the reality is that it's happening, and the stories that are coming out of that, I think, are really very exciting, and they obviously are moving the needle as to the broader resiliency posture of these organizations.
Yeah, it is fascinating. I love the comments also coming through around IT and cybersecurity. One earlier was saying that it's the worst place for it to live. And part of me 100% agrees with that, because resilience is a lot bigger than purely just cybersecurity. And the other part of me also thinks about, is this a transitionary period where if you need to get more influence, and there's a huge amount of influence and a huge amount of threat sitting under the IT cybersecurity, is that a journey of tailwind and drafting, as you would in a cycling group, to essentially get to the top of the mountain and essentially and pave out a more integrated approach to resilience. So I'm not saying one way or the other is that right or wrong, but I think there's a big question mark around just the amount of ground you might be able to cover if you've got the backing of a CISO of the sort. So interesting to see that it is there. My next question for everyone is, where do you believe resilience should report through to in an organization? I'm going to launch this and just see. Okay, everyone, here we go. Back into poll land, out of the chat for just a second. Let's get you into the poll. So where should resilience report it through to in an organization? Should we have a chief resilience officer? Should it be the chief risk officer? Should it be the CISO, COO, CFO, other? Again, hey, there's, I could drop every title under the sun in here, but if you've got something weird and wonderful, let's see it in the comments, please. Watching this go. Chief resilience, there's a big drive here for chief resilience officer, which is really interesting. CEO, that's a good one, Helen. Laz, really depends. I think that's a very fair call. All right, I'm gonna start. Where are we? We're 100% answered. Excellent. Thank you for your participation. Okay, let's have a look at the results here. So we've got just shy of 40% on Chief Resilience Officer. Looks like there's a big call for the CRO, the new CRO, Chief Resilience Officer, in this crowd, which doesn't surprise me. And then Chief Risk Officer is tailing just there at 30%. So CISO is there at 6%. Again, I'm interested in your thoughts on that. If you think it should go through to the CISO, and you feel free to comment. This is it's a safe space. Drop your comments into the chat. I'm really interested in your take on that. Chief Operating Officer, we have certainly seen that plenty of times in Australia when it's not sitting on the Chief Risk Officer. And then obviously anything else coming through in the comments. We saw CEO, President CEO come through a few times in the comments as well. James, is it time for the Chief Resilience Officer? Is it time?
In the spirit of the holidays, Marcus, I think that resilience needs to reside in our hearts every day. But seriously, I don't care where it resides. Here's my goal when I work with an organization. I want it to reside with an executive who has influence, who has the ability to get things done. I don't care if that's the head of facilities, the head of HR, the CRO. I love that no one voted CFO, by the way. Thank you, everyone, for that. That makes my cold heart happy. But again, I think it should be different every organization. We all know effective CIOs, CISOs. We all know ineffective CEOs, COOs, EIEIOs. Pick your letter. I want it. If it's important to the organization, it's going to be assigned to somebody who is important to the organization. That's really what I care about. And, I want it to be highly placed. I want it to be with a person who's influential, and I don't want it to be 12 levels down. Because if you have a C title and you don't report to the CEO or you don't have access, you don't have a C title. You've got a great business card and you make some good money, but you don't have influence.
Wow. Tell us what you really think, James. Paula, anything else?
I'm just getting started, man. I'm fired up.
Limbering up. Paula.
James, I thought we'd be disagreeing more than we are. I'm waiting for those.
No, I'm on the Marcus caffeine plan. So for every espresso he had, I had a Coke Zero. I'm up to like 12 right now. So my head might explode, my heart might explode, but I can't, whatever happens the next 30 minutes, we're in for it.
No, I tend to agree with you, James. Like, I feel like every organization is its own snowflake. And what's interesting is that, I had shared the Deloitte survey earlier in the week on LinkedIn, and had gotten a lot of discussion, from the community, kind of weighing in on this question. And I think, so overwhelmingly, like the survey said, 80% of people that they had polled had said, yes, we need a chief resilience officer. Like, it's the only way to sort out this whole concept of resilience, make it a priority for firms. I mean, we all know that this has to have the attention of the organization in order for it to have the impact that we're looking for. But what was interesting was in the comments, from the post, like overwhelmingly the sentiment was no. Like, why the hell are people doing this already, right? Like, why aren't boards and executive teams already focused on resilience? And if you need to appoint somebody into that role, then there must be some sort of gap. Now, I have mixed feelings on this because I do think in some cultures, to James, your point, you do need a point person, right? Or it's never going to be mobilized effectively. And I think you do see that with things like SMF 24, where they did sort of anoint the COO or the CISO as like that chief executive that's ultimately responsible for, the operations of the firm. And ultimately, if there's a failure, then you have like one throat to choke, right? And they did, and we have seen results as part of that. Why are you laughing, James?
Oh, just your term, one throat to choke. I don't think that's very friendly, but I'll go. I like it.
Very real. Very real.
That's very American, but I like it as an American. So
spoken from, it's as the Florida man says.
That's right.
So I think no matter where you sit on in terms of like the side of the aisle that you're on, like, yes, we need a chief resilience officer, or no, we don't, because it really belongs to everybody. Like, I think the whole sentiment of like, it needs to live in your heart, as much as I was laughing at that, it's totally true. Like, it needs to be integrated into everything that we think about and everything that we do as an organization. And until we get to that point, I think figuring out like how that's woven into the strategic priorities of your organization, I think is the main point there.
Yeah, well, does that bring a question around what does the accountability metric need to look like if it's going to sit in one chief pocket or another chief's pocket? I was thinking about this earlier when we were talking about the, obviously the insurance spend of a major organization is significant, like to the point where organizations will start their own insurance companies like captives to underwrite that because of the cost of insurance. Now, there's no chief insurance officer, yet they're able to get the influence and sway of that. Now, that's often, quite often chopped up between a CFO or a CRO, but there's some direct intangible accountability around the cost of risk, around insurance premiums, and around losses as well. So I guess the question mark is, do we need to create a more tangible read and measurement from an impact perspective around resilience that attaches to a chief KPI for it to reside in one camp or the other? I mean, what are our thoughts? And again, open question to everyone around how we're actually measuring resilience at the moment. What do we think is actually a really good read of resilience, and how effective our resilience program is being at the moment? James, have you got some thoughts on that?
Yes, sir, I do. Which brings me to my first prop of the day. I'm so excited. I have with me, this is my Santa Bear. I got this Santa Bear in 1986, which tells you two things, Marcus. It tells you I'm old, and it tells you I have a strange, unhealthy, maybe sentimentality with Christmas. But here's what Santa Bear says about measuring resilience. Santa Bear doesn't care how you measure a resilience, because I hate this question again, because it goes back to my resilience program should be different than yours. To me, resilience is no matter what happens and when it happens and when more than one thing happens, that you not only get back to business as usual, but that you thrive, right? You don't just survive, you don't just make it through, but you thrive. And for every organization, for every community, that's different. So I want us to be mindful of, there are some commonalities between resilient groups, but I worry about if someone says, hey, here's my KPI for resilience, you should all use that. People are going to be maybe going down a path that would make sense for a retail organization as a KPI for resilience, but not a manufacturer or not a nonprofit. And that's, I think, where I struggle with some of these risk and resilience frameworks, because they're frankly ridiculous to me. Because what makes Marcus family resilient should not have the same KPI as what makes Illuminer resilient. And yes, I know by having a stuffed animal next to me, I'm totally negating any seriousness of my argument. So that's one of my, I guess, KPIs of I've gone too far.
Firstly, I'm fascinated because he looks really clean, which means your crawl space is like really well intact. It's an indicator. He's lasted from 1986.
He's got a whole story, but we don't have time for Santa Bear. But Santa Bear doesn't care about what are good measures of resilience, I guess. So that's why he lives a pristine, happy life.
There's definitely some truth in that. And I think that, I mean, if you think about some of the positive war stories that came out of COVID, I know firsthand executives and even business owners of organizations that totally pivoted their business in terms of what they were producing. So major manufacturers of, sporting team outfits and turned into gowns and masks. So that wasn't in the response plan. So it goes obviously beyond purely how do you respond to a situation, how do you create that business agility to thrive when you've got a really difficult set of circumstances emerging. Paula, I'm interested in your take on this, because it is a little bit bigger than purely just that. Is it something that we measure right across the executive, or is it an accountability metric for one executive? Have you got any thoughts in terms of what you've seen work or fail?
Well, I think if we're saying that resilience needs to be integrated into everything that we do, then I think there's a component of resilience that's embedded in everything that we report on, from an organization perspective. I think what we need to get away from is like the whole philosophy around like, how many plans do I have? Were they exercised? Like some of those very more tactical measures of resilience. Because when you think about it, like that doesn't really unpack for your constituents, like the impact that you're driving, right? And so the things that you do want to unpack for people are things like, application uptime, or even looking at trends over time, or resiliency of your team. I know there's there was a big dialogue around the great attrition, and looking at like the impact of incidents and overtime on your team, and kind of their likelihood to attrit. I think there's all sorts of connections that risk and resilience teams draw to the surface. And I think because we are able to effectively understand how the organization works, we're able to effectively prompt questions that maybe our executive stakeholders or others in the organization, because they don't have that broad view of the organization and the broader ecosystem, they sort of miss those things right in the nuance. So I think pulling that up, thinking about what are the questions that you should be asking of your constituents, what questions are your constituents asking of you? And I think that's been another positive trend that we've seen in the industry. BCI, we hosted a roundtable, 30% of our roundtable participants said that actually it's been less of a pull or less of a push for resilience teams in terms of the conversation with the broader organization. Has started to become more of this, their business partners really asking them critical questions as to how to make themselves either more resilient or how to better respond to incidents or how to ensure that they had the capability or the muscle memory to respond effectively to those events. So I think partnering with the broader business on what those metrics should look like, and then also thinking beyond that as to, well, what are my business counterparts not thinking about? And then going back to that earlier point around, well, in the big picture, what's really meaningful to the market, customers, my organization, and really mobilizing that. I think that ultimately is sort of the opportunity and the obligation of the community. And I didn't know we were bringing props, otherwise I would have brought Legos.
Always bring props, Paula. There's a great comment in the chat that I like. It says, don't cheat this by taking a generic set of KPIs from another leading organization. You need to understand what is critical to your organization, how to protect it, and how to drive it to innovate and stay ahead of your competitors.
Yeah, and that's a big, in its own right, that's a big piece of work in terms of understanding the strategic objectives of the organization from the top down, isn't it? That's not a throwaway comment of, hey, yeah, we've got it. This is what we're looking for. Let's just execute against that. That's a process in its own right. And I think that's a very valuable process, which you can then re-articulate back to the organization as to why we're going to do what we're going to do when the resilience activities and programs starts rolling out across the organization. I think the what's in it for me question is an important one. Once you start getting away from just the chief executive and start getting down into the organization, so you can relate it back to a common language. I'm going to keep moving. There's fantastic comments there, guys. Please, this is the chat channel, as always, is on fire. So thank you very much for sharing and collaborating there. I want to spend a few minutes just in terms of some of the impacts we're seeing on this convergence, or perceived convergence of risk and resilience. Regulation. I love regulation. No, I mean, yes and no. What impact do we think that the regulators are having on risk and resilience? I mean, regulators feel like they drive a lot, but at the same time can quite often be behind in terms of where we are from an execution perspective. Yes, I'll hang on to that one as a personal comment, because I'll probably get it in the neck for that later on as well. How big an impact do we think that regulators are actually having on the convergence of risk and resilience, or the shape of organizations and the fabric of resilience going forward? Paula, I know you spent a lot of time under the skin of op risk over the years, or op res, I should say, which is in Australia actually called op risk.
Yeah.
I'm interested in your take on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so two things. One, they are having a massive impact on how firms are thinking about this, because I think there's nothing like a stick, unfortunately, than if you're talking about really building like a minimum standard. Yes, exactly. I need the stick and the carrot. If you're talking about really enforcing a minimum standard for resiliency across an entire ecosystem, it has to be regulation. I think that's just the reality of human nature. And I think most firms have an overabundance of priorities, and unless it's something that the firm has to do, like human nature is to just band-aid things, right? And we do very little planning for the long term unless we have to. And so what better way to make it a priority for organizations than, a regulatory authority basically saying that you must do this. I think what's interesting is that so there is this dynamic in terms of how the policy writers are thinking about it, and then what the actual auditors are, how they're orchestrating their reviews. And I think like when you talk to some of the policy writers or you follow their work, or I think one thing that's obvious is it's less about the letter of the law and it's more about the spirit of the law and this acknowledgement that, hey, like we're all figuring this out together. Like nobody has the secret sauce to resilience, right? And it's always changing, it's always improving. Like really we're on a journey of continuous learning together. And like at a micro level within our organizations, within our ecosystem, but then as a global community, like we're all learning from each other. It's one of the things that I love most about this industry is just how connected we all are, right? And we all learn from one another. But I think in terms of ultimately, it has to go beyond meeting the letter of the law, right? Like, how do you really use that as a basis, right? Or maybe it's using some of these frameworks as sort of a way to demonstrate the art of the possible. But how do you think beyond that? And to some of James' points earlier in the conversation, really think about what resilience means for your organization and how you need to really purpose build something that is aligned to the culture, the process, even like the makeup of your organization. And I think so like regulators have a key role in that, but I think we need to think beyond that. And I think what's interesting is a lot of the non-regulated industries have, there's some really interesting innovation coming out of those communities because they're not so focused on the letter of the law.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think the conversations we have with non-regulated entities are probably the most innovative conversations we can have. And they are. And there's a lot of innovation happening in that space that is really focused on making resilience really pragmatic as opposed to really compliant, because it has to be, because people don't care, because their day-to-day jobs doesn't give them enough time to care about it being a compliance activity. So I have to admit, most of our clients are actually financial services institutions, but we get to have a lot of fun with those who aren't, just on that fact alone. James, I'm interested in your take on the impact regulators are having. Some great comments in here as well.
Yeah, they're having no impact. My answer is regulators are having no impact because of what Paula said about the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. There's some great comments in here. Regulators only ever play catch up. We are constantly educating the regulators. Yeah. And I agree with both of you. When I work with most organizations that are in a regulated industry, they are focused on how do we meet the letter of that law and nothing more. So regulations are often very reactionary. Show me a risk or regulation around resilience that has truly mitigated non-shareholder risk, not just protecting investors, or has made organizations more resilient. I don't see one out there. We passed Sarbanes-Oxley in the United States after WorldCom and Enron melted down. That didn't stop anything. That just created more work for evil consultants like me. But I don't think it mitigated risk. To your point, where it's interesting when organizations look at the spirit of a law or regulation, and that's where I love working in non-regulated industries. My favorite industry to work in right now is manufacturing. There aren't BC regs. There's not resilient regs for manufacturing. These organizations are looking at how do we become resilient? How do we thrive against our competitors? What do we need to do? They're not asking, based on a standard, based on a reg, just based on what's happening in reality. And that's where, to Paula's point, that spirit of the law, that spirit of the regulation is actually impactful But unfortunately, auditors don't audit against the spirit of a reg. It's a black and white. The letter says this, you didn't do that. I don't see resilience coming from the regulations itself.
So once, I think the takeaway you're trying to get at there, James, is until the regulators can actually regulate against the spirit of the law as opposed to the letter of the law, i.e. the auditable document, are we going to see a real positive impact from regulators?
Well, yeah, that's an impossible task. You can't measure against the spirit of the law. We're not in a Hallmark Christmas movie right now.
I was just thinking about the
yeah,
three
we need organization.
Christmas.
Yeah, I'm the ghost of risk past and the ghost of resilience future and the ghost of business continuity today. That's my next webinar topic. But we need organizations to take those regulations and look at it as the bare minimum and not here's best practice, here's how you thrive.
Yeah. All right. I'll keep moving because we could probably spend all day talking about that.
I do want to call out though that there are exceptions. There's always the exception, right? There are some extraordinary teams doing like really thought-provoking work in financial services and insurance. So they really are moving the needle.
Yeah.
And I think like when you do hear the regulators talk about like, yeah, we haven't solved this, right? Like we're never going to solve it perfectly. Bad things are going to happen. Like we know that. And so I think it's how do we kind of lead this effort together? And I think there's some really impressive work being done in financial services. But to your point, I agree with you, James. Like I think when push comes to shove, a lot of organizations need to design for the minimum. And that's just the unfortunate reality of like, there's never enough time.
And to your point, those financial services companies that are doing innovative work are doing it because they're innovative people who work at innovative companies and not because of a regulatory standard.
This is true.
That's my immediate reflection on that as well. So I think the most mature resilience team I know in Australia is actually a financial institution. And that doesn't come down to the regulator, that comes down to the team, and the person leading the team is probably the most innovative resilience practitioner I know in the Asia Pacific region. And that's a personal drive of driving resilience into the organization and taking that upon themselves. And yeah, he's got to meet regulation, of course, like fact. But I think that's where it's important to have, I guess, a really robust community of resilience practitioners that actually care about driving resilience in the organization. So again, thank you everyone for turning up. I'll just say that right now. If you're here and you're dialing in at 5 a.m. in Australia, you're probably that person. Okay, I will keep moving because time's churning away. Couple of big ones I want to have a chat about. I'll leave one for the next one. But I'm interested in, okay, I might be opening up my own Pandora's box here. I'm interested in your thoughts in terms of what the vendor market, what kind of impact that has on resilience. Because I'm biased, obviously. I'm now classified as a vendor per se. I guess Paula, you are too. James, you're not. You're a consultant. You're an evil consultant, as you've. I'm
an evil consultant, and all of my non-disparaging agreements with former vendors have expired. So ask away.
So I'm interested in this because what does this look like? What is the impact vendors are having on the resilience space? Because I know we obviously play a huge role in terms of driving process automation, thought. We have resources for innovation and investment. I'm interested in your take on this, James. What kind of impact are we having? And where's the popcorn? Says
I think. Melinda, yeah, where is the popcorn? The popcorn is off screen. I think from a positive impact, vendors allow us to take our risk and resilience programs and automate them, which in the best of cases frees up our time from doing tactical work to allow us to focus on strategic work. I think it also allows us to supercharge our program in the best of cases. In the worst of cases, it's a cash grab. every vendor now says they do all of risk, they do all of resilience, anything you want. We've got everything under the sun. And I've yet to see those kind of programs work where you buy a software that can do cybersecurity to BC to ERM to supply chain to privacy to data. It's like you get everything and none of it works. So I think in the worst case scenario, vendors are disingenuous in saying we offer everything for everyone. And we've certainly seen, and I know we're not supposed to talk about this, but I'll bring it up. We've seen a lot of private equity injected into the industry. We've seen a lot of M&A. I was a part of that. I was at a very large company that acquired another very large company. And those kind of M&As in that PE, the last few years has been disappointing to me as a professional, because I haven't seen how any of that money or that M&A has made our profession more efficient. I haven't seen outside of Illuminar a lot of true innovation in software vendors in our space. It just kind of seems to be more of the same in different colors. And I don't see how a lot of these PE firms or these M&As have leveraged their power of scale to help people in our profession. There's not a lot of webinars like this one that are there for the professionals in our space. You guys don't put this behind a paywall, right? Most organizations do, if they're even considering the people in our profession at all, outside of just being a user on a platform.
Yeah, and that was probably the driver of the question. I mean, we are seeing a lot of consolidation in the industry and a lot of sticking together of risk, GRC, resilience products. And I mean, this is an open question for the chat channel as well. It's like, is that actually driving a positive change in resilience, or is it just meshing together of technologies and hoping for the best? So, I mean, Paula, any
Yeah, I equate it to.
Go for it. No, please, James.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I equate it to, if you go into a restaurant and they're like, we have sushi, we have French food, we have Cajun food, we have Creole food, we have Indian food, we have American food. You know that restaurant's going to suck.
You just
right? I would rather have a restaurant. Yeah, and when you go to a buffet in Vegas, are you going for quality or quantity? Right? You're not going for quality. So for me, some of these vendors that offer everything, I would rather you have an emphasis. Paula calls it the North Star. I'd rather you have that your mission statement and do that well, instead of do 50 things and be a master of mediocrity.
I have a slightly different view on that, as you might expect. I think part of the value of technology is really breaking down those silos. And I think that the challenge when you get into these like more modular systems, or like systems that had like a foundation even that was modular, even though they claim to be more integrated now, is like you have a very siloed view of the world. And I think like even looking outside of the domain of risk and resilience, like look at the field of, business intelligence or process mining, or, fill in the blank, right? And like the problem that we're all like universally trying to solve is like, how do I sort of build a digital model of my organization, and then, sort of apply different levers or conditions on it and see, what breaks, right? And how do I fix it in the most expedient way? I think that the flip side of that is technology isn't everything. And sometimes like, I think it can be positioned as like the cure all, like it's going to figure out everything for you. And I mean, in all fairness, there's been a lot of really impressive advances. In fact, I was just looking at some of the impressive kind of work that AI can do in terms of even like codifying like a message that, from a marketing perspective, like the way that AI can assimilate data and ideas is really, I mean, it's advancing in a remarkable way. But I think ultimately, especially in our field, there's always going to be the role of the human being. And so technology is, to your point, it's about supporting the human beings on the line making the decisions, right? And effectively mobilizing humanity against like whatever the monster is, right? And so that's the piece that I think sometimes we and I mean, I've worked my entire career in technology. And so sometimes like we as solution providers get enamored by like, oh, well, it's going to be a magic pill that does everything for us. And the reality is like, it's not, right? Like it is a tool for humanity. Like it helps you bring data together. It does help you present and engage and empower people. But ultimately, it is all about your team. It is all about engaging your organization and really providing data insight tools, really where you need it.
Yeah, and that's really absolutely on point. Points coming through in the comments there. I mean, Milena, technology is an enabler, absolutely. The service of the purpose. Again, James Mitchell, AI with human curation, powerful combination, AI alone. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, the point being, like, this is really to empower people to essentially build resilience in an organization. It's not the silver bullet. It's a supporting proponent and part of the ingredients in the cookbook, so to speak. I'm going to keep moving because we are nearly out of time. We've got 6 minutes left. In 6 minutes or less, because I have to do a wrap as well. I want to talk about 2023, what's on the agenda, but the big question I really want to pose with this, do I have time? Let's do a poll. Yes, I have time for a poll. Last poll, everyone. Okay, so about 2023, I'm going to ask you about ESG. I want to know where this sits because there's a lot of talk about ESG. It is really kicking in now. I mean, it's been spoken about for the last 2 to 3 years in a pretty big way as it started filtering through as an investment requirement to answer questions around this. Does ESG have executive sponsorship and feature in your resilience program activities? Yes, no, it's coming. If you've got a different opinion, drop it in the comments. As always, please drop it in the comments anyway. I love your opinions in terms of even if it's yes or no, why. I'm seeing a really good mix come through. People are all over this, which is good. We got 100% answered. No, it's still going. It's not 100% answered, then it's still going. All right, I'll give you another moment. James, before I jump into that though, what do you think should be on the 2023 agenda?
I want to go back to what Paula said earlier about, organizations that are in financial services or otherwise that are doing innovative work in our space. And I find this interesting correlation that the most innovative organizations that we work with are also the organizations that are hyper-focused on ESG. They really see climate change aspect of ESG. They really see all aspects of ESG as driving the conversation over the next few years. And like I said, the most innovative organizations I work with have been, actively involved, thoughtfully involved on how do we create and advance an ESG program here at our organization. So I expect that to continue to grow in 2023. And like you said, grab onto cybersecurity tailwinds. Everyone talks cyber. Your resilience program or your risk program should be aligned in some way with that to capture some of that spotlight in 2023.
I'm going to share the results before we push through here. So we've got a 38% yes, a 29% no, and a 33% it's coming. And I think everyone else was either drinking coffee or eating popcorn at the time, which is totally fair given the hour of the day. Paula, any surprise to what you're seeing there?
It's interesting. The yeses are maybe a smidge lower than I would have expected. And maybe it's because we're bundling ES and G together. I'm going to go back to the example of Operis. There was a major bank presenting at that conference. And one of the examples that really struck me, especially, now being a vendor that focuses on kind kind of this concept of micro simulations. They were talking about how, well, one, like this was someone that leads risk that now owns resilience. So that in itself, I thought was really provocative and interesting. And he went on to say that like one of his key challenges is around this issue of climate risk, right? And the reality is that, and this is what we're seeing from the regulators, this is what we're seeing, I think, just generally within that broader sustainability community, is like, it's not enough for us to measure a report, right? Like we need to mobilize and take action. And so, he was talking a lot about like, how do I educate my stakeholders across the business in such a way that they understand that climate risk needs to be thought of in everything that they do as a business. And so if you're, building new products and services, you're selecting a vendor, if you're, building a new building somewhere, right? Selecting a site, like all of these things need to think, you need to think about climate risk. So I think when you think about, our role as risk and resilience, like how do we educate others on climate risk, and not just what you see headlines in the news, right, in the media. How do you help them make those critical connections to what they do day in and day out? And it goes back to that conversation we had about integration and like being truly focused on your customer, the market, and your broader business to really drive impact at the levels that you want to.
Yeah, I had a fascinating conversation with a finance leader of a property group in Australia on the weekends. He's a good friend of mine, and he made the comment that they have packages of land development that have been turned down by the board because they weren't able to not only show that they were able to show that it was environmental neutral, so net zero impact on the earth, but it didn't have a positive impact from an environmental perspective. And so they've moved beyond just going net zero from an emissions or a sustainability perspective and moving into the positive space. So I know in Australia, and certainly in certain industries, it's certainly rocketed to the top because there is such a drive right from the investment arm in terms of making sure that sustainability is there. But I mentioned we're actually out of time. I missed the clock. Okay. Any other comments? Please drop them through now, because we are going to see. We'll be obviously reiterating on this, sharing some of this content. You're going to get an email off the back of this that is essentially going to provide an option to give you to get some feedback from you. As I mentioned before, feedback is absolutely a gift. We've got some more events and things coming up. We've obviously got our cyber fundamentals. It's probably worth checking out. If cyber is actually on your list for 2023, go and have a look at that. That's getting a huge amount of appetite for that. I think more than anything, though, I do want to send a massive thank you to everyone who's turned up today. I'll start with the panelists, James Green, Paula Fontana. Please, thank you very much for your attendance, your active engagement. It's been a really robust conversation, so I can't thank you enough for taking the time out today. And to everyone who turned up in that chat channel again was absolutely on fire. So thank you very much for being so open, very respectful. I didn't see any daggers getting thrown, just really good questions. It's a bit late in the day for props, James. It's never too late for a Santa hat.
It's never too late. It's never too late for props, Mark.
It's never too late for props. So thank you everyone for turning up. If you've got collaborators in the industry that you want part of this conversation, please tag them as we start promoting this back on LinkedIn again. We're trying to create a community here of people who are forward thinking and who are going to contribute to a more resilient world. So please, if you've got thought leaders in the industry you think should be involved, let's get them involved. I think the conversation can only get better when we do that. James, Paula, thank you very much. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Marcus.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you again soon. And think big, because the world does need you. Talk soon. Bye-bye.